All the right side, please. Thank you, guys. Sorry, darling. Right side, please, everybody.
Right side, please.
Up top, right side.
Straight ahead. Straight
To
ahead.
your left, please.
Gary, straight ahead,
Awesome,
please.
thank you.
Kristin, please, in the middle. Thanks, man.
We must now select my successor, and it's only one man the opposition will accept.
He stands for one thing, and one thing only, himself.
Why have I been forced to send for Churchill? This record is a catastrophe.
Let them see your true qualities, your lack of vanity.
Yeah, my iron will.
Your sense of humour.
Ho, ho, ho.
Your Majesty.
It is my duty to invite you to take up the position of Prime Minister of this United Kingdom.
I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister.
The Germans have encircled 60 British and French divisions. We are looking at a collapse of Western Europe within the next few days.
How long have they got if we don't rescue them?
Maybe 2 days. We would need a miracle to get our men out.
You have the full weight of the world on your shoulders.
We're facing certain defeat on land, the annihilation of our army, and imminent invasion. We must negotiate peace talks.
When will the lesson be learned? You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth!
Nonsense. The only slippery slope.
Would you stop interrupting me while I am interrupting you? We have before us many long months of struggle and suffering. Even though many old and famous states have fallen into the grip of the Nazi rule, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender! For without victory, there can be no survival.
Thank you very much. Welcome to tonight's screening.
God, I want to see more movies like this, movies that are just creative for the sake of being creative and free.
We sold out the Elgin Theater!
My people! Toronto Film Festival!
Great films, they leave me feeling a little more alive and connected, and they remind me to laugh and hope and hurt and feel.
I just want to tell great stories, and I want to tell different stories. We don't only have to tell one type of story.
Well, good morning. My name is Eric Kohanek, and I'd like to welcome you to the press conference for Darkest Hour, the sweeping story of the early days of Prime Minister Winston Churchill's time in office in the UK. Darkest Hour is part of the TIFF Gala Presentations program. It will have its Canadian premiere and its festival red carpet premiere tonight at 9:30 at Roy Thompson Hall. With us today, sitting next to me, we have the film's director, Joe Wright. In the middle of the couch, we've got Gary Oldman, who tackles the role of Winston Churchill in the film. To Gary's right, we have Scott Thomas, who takes on the role of Clementine, Winston Churchill's wife. On the left side of Gary, we have Ben Mendelsohn, who plays the part of King George VI. And last but certainly not least, Anthony McCartan, who is the screenwriter for the film. If you have any questions, please stick up your hands. We'll get a microphone to you. I'll start it off by saying, Gary, quite the performance.
Thank you.
What was it that drew you to play Winston Churchill?
The script, the history, the man, and it's been a journey of of discovery. I guess there's a mild, fascination that I had with him. The quotes are very famous. I think I have a book of, I had a book of quotes on my bookshelf. But it was just the opportunity to play this iconic character. I mean, they do come in, roles come in, they come across the desk, I'm not someone out there like searching or craving to play a particular role or character. And initially, I was very wary of doing it, just because not only is he so iconic and so famous, but there's a great many actors that have played him before me. So it was quite sort of, when you've got people like Richard Burton and Albert Finney, Robert Hardy, they're big shoes to step into.
I'll toss it over to you and tell me how this project came together and the process.
Well, Working Title, who I've worked with many times before, sent me the screenplay by Anthony McCartan, and I laughed a lot. The script, surprisingly, given its title, Darkest Hour, is actually very, very funny. So I laughed, and then I cried. And I was quite surprised by that reaction. So I called up Eric Fellner and I said, this is really, really good. But I'm not sure that I'd go and see a movie about Churchill. And Eric and I talked a little bit more about it, and he said, well, what about Gary Oldman? And as soon as Gary's name came up, I knew that I'd go and see that movie, and therefore I had to make it. Gary's, been a hero of mine since I was about 15, since he played Sid Vicious in Sid and Nancy. And the idea of a career that goes from Sid Vicious to Winston Churchill seemed like too tantalizing, really. So I went and met Gary, and I think we were both kind of a bit nervous of meeting each other, really. I was certainly nervous of meeting Gary, and I was surprised to find that Gary was kind of nervous of meeting me. And we went outside and vaped together. And by the end of that vape, we were like brothers, really, brothers. That was it.
That's a true story.
That's what happened. Honesty is best policy in these situations.
Absolutely. Anthony, talk about writing the screenplay and what resources did you use to uncover things that I don't think a lot of people knew occurred in the first few days of Churchill's.
Yeah, I kind of had known for some time that 3 of the greatest speeches ever written had Winston Churchill's name on them, and he'd written them in the unfathomably short period of time of 4 weeks. So the idea had always been there. What pressures, what forces had exerted themselves on him to rise to such eloquence, and it turns out that this period, from the first day he becomes Prime Minister, and he was a compromised choice as a Prime Minister. Nobody really thought he had it in him to lead the country at all, let alone in its gravest crisis. But he turned himself sort of within 4 weeks into the Churchill we know. So that involved a lot of reading and stuff. But most dauntingly, and a bit like Gary, I suspect, as hard as it is to play him, it's extremely daunting to write for Winston Churchill. He could string a word or two together, that man, and they were very big, sort of literary shoes to fill. So that was the big challenge for me.
Kristin, how familiar were you with Clemmy and her history and her story before you came to this project?
Well, not very. I mean, everybody I sort of grew up with images of Winston Churchill and this rather strange-looking woman who was his wife. She had a very particular hairdo, and her clothes were all seemed to be from another era. Always very, very elegant. But apart from that, I didn't really know much about her. And then I discovered that she was an absolute fighter and defended many, many different causes and was incredibly engaged during the war and was an immense support to this man who was riddled with doubt and insecurities. And what I think is so fascinating about this film is that you have this man who was able to articulate all this incredible feelings of what's the word, pride in this country, and what's the word I'm looking for? You're the man with the words. To kind of engage people and get people together and unite people. But the man himself, the man who was creating all these amazing speeches and things like that, was actually just a human being like any other. And what I find what was attractive to me in playing this part was the fact that I could actually help reveal the very human side to him, the man, rather than the hero.
Right. And Ben, much as Gary said, there have been several actors who have also played King George VI over the years.
Indeed.
How was it, what resources did you rely on to prepare for your characters?
I mainly just watched whatever newsreel stuff and whatnot that I could watch of his. There was, I knew Jared Harris was playing him in the Crown. And I didn't want to go near that. I think Jared Harris is a fantastic actor. I didn't want to get that kind of like spooky stuff. And that's it. You know, I looked at a bunch of stuff and then tried very hard to just kick the football correctly. That's it. That's the job.
All right, let's sort of open it up to the floor down here in the front.
Bruce Kirkland of the Toronto Sun and Post Media News Network. A question for Gary, picking up on what you said about the astonishing names of the actors who have played Churchill before, and I'm glad you mentioned Robert Hardy, one of my favorite actors, period. And how do you get beyond this admiration for other performances? How do you get beyond the newsreels and the fame of these speeches that you referred to that astonishingly were written so quickly, and get beyond the historical record that he was a bit of a boor and a bully and a kind of, he was, to many people, not a nice man, and turn him into a performance and a human being that we can empathize with?
Well, I think in part there's a lot of a sort of quite radical revisionism that goes on with Churchill to begin with. I don't know if he was such a boorish, cruel man as he is sometimes portrayed by detractors and critics of him. There's those people out there that love Churchill and there's those that don't. So you have to find your... I mean, in terms of other performances, I didn't watch them. I watched Robert Hardy when it was on TV many, many years ago, but I didn't want to be contaminated or influenced by other people's performances. We've all got an idea of who Churchill was, and a lot of that comes from the people that have played him, not necessarily the actual man. So the footage, for me, the newsreels and the Pathé footage was paramount. It was, to hear him and to see him was for me the way in, apart from also the reading of the history. So I had, I guess, an impression of what I thought who Churchill was, And then I started to watch this news footage, and there's one particular piece of him in Africa where he's in a tent with some of these soldiers, and he's uncharacteristically drinking beer, because that's all they had. And it's hot, and it's swarming with flies. And, I mean, he's like a pig in manure. You know, he's with the guys at the front. He was a soldier. He had great admiration for these people that put themselves in harm's way. He's alive. He's alert. He's skipping around. And he's 65, yet he's moving, jumping around like a sort of 30-year-old. There's a sparkle in his eye. There's a cherubicness about him. So I started to see a man, and even Joe and I talked about it a little in rehearsal, because occasionally we would be in rehearsal and you would say, he's really naughty, isn't he? He's quite sort of cheeky. And so I think that's how I started to sort of build the man, and have. My research has not stopped. I recently watched a wonderful 3-part documentary by the historian David Starkey, and there were just so many books that one couldn't even get through before shooting, so they are still there on the shelf to be read, you know, beyond the film. And my admiration for him and my is tenfold. Working on this film and having the opportunity to play him, it was a privilege every day to come in and play him.
How much of a privilege was it sitting there with all that prosthetic makeup being put on? How difficult was that for you?
No, as I said earlier, you know, here's a man who's 65 years old and he takes on Adolf Hitler. So for me to sit there in 3 hours of makeup is, you know, could be a lot worse, couldn't it?
That's true. One question down back here. Oh. Go ahead, back there.
Hi, everyone. Russ Nelson, Red Carpet News. Congratulations on an astonishing film. My question is to the whole panel, but perhaps starting with Mr. Oldman. We've seen a recent series of superb films, of which this is one, exploring this obviously traumatic point in human history. And I'm curious, Mr. Oldman, if you have a sense of why, particularly now, we seem to that point in our history, and what you think that the film specifically has to say to a modern audience.
Are you in the room, are you?
We're lurking, way back here. There you go.
He's over there. He's over there.
Like a shadow in the night.
Strange, disembodied, you know, quality.
Well, Churchill, when he, in the 10 years that he was out of office, and we sort of refer to it as the wilderness years. They were quite fertile, and he was writing about his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill. And there's a theory that this historian has, is that it was preparation for the job in hand. Churchill was, and actually the work that he did on the book, 1 million words, 4 volumes over 10 years, that the work that he did on it prepared him for the job at hand when it came down to the wire. And Churchill believed that we were in fact between wars. So there was this sort of incredible era of pacifism was universal. It was all peace, peace, peace. We must have peace. because of just the catastrophe of the First World War, the lives that were taken, the financial burden on Europe, and then of course the financial crash. But Churchill, looking at past patterns, and he was always someone saying, you know, look to history, always look to history, and it will guide you, saw a pattern happening, and through his research of the Duke of Marlborough, and believed that we were, in a sense, in the eye of the hurricane, that we were between two wars, and that second one, the Second World War, was actually coming. He also had the advantage of, in 1932, going to Munich to research the book at the Battle of Romilly and Blenheim, and saw what was happening in Germany firsthand. He then came back, and as you know, a backbencher, and stood up in Parliament and talked about Hitler and what was happening, that they weren't looking for status and revitalizing their economy. Yes, they were doing that, but he said those young kids walking around in brown shirts, he said they're not looking for status, they're looking for weapons. And he actually stood up in Parliament and said, Hitler's killing the Jews, and you know what? He's going to come and kill you. No one believed him. Because in a way it was kind of a little what you might call PC. That we had good relations with Germany. We didn't want to offend them or upset them. Fascism, I guess, was quite popular, wasn't it? Versus communism. Maybe we're seeing that pattern again. Maybe we have been in between, and something is coming. As you said before about leadership, you know, the world wanting leadership, and a Churchill. Maybe that's what they call it, the zeitgeist. What's in the air that makes someone like Churchill become current and popular. Does that answer it?
Yes. Do you agree with that, Kristin?
I don't know, I'm so cold, I can't think.
Do you want my jacket?
Yeah, take one.
So I was listening to Gary. What was what was I agreeing about?
Whether there's the reason why there's so many films about this particular period at the moment.
Yeah, I think. Yeah. Yes, that may very well be the case. It's feelings of insecurity in the world that make us look back at this period and think, well, somebody was able to save us, so there's maybe hope somewhere. I think that's possibly some of it, a kind of faith in someone showing up who talks sense. I don't know.
I think also that you know there is we are in uncertain times, and there's a lot of anxiety about and justifiable fear, but in the journeying around America and Canada and at home in the UK, I see an amazing level of resistance and protest, and I think I actually, that fills me with great hope and optimism. I think it's extraordinary, and I think that Churchill resisted. He kicked and he screamed when it wasn't particularly fashionable. And so that level of resistance, I think, is an extraordinary testament to the man. You know, we now know that he was right, but at the time, you know, you didn't know whether he was right or not, you know. And so that I find hugely impressive and optimistic and hopeful.
You see, I think that it seems now, in hindsight, like a no-brainer. Because you go, oh, Hitler, yeah, what an evil son of a bitch. And yeah, absolutely, you know. But we didn't know at the time. I don't think people were aware, certainly early on, just how sort of maniacal and crazy that the man was. So he was a lone voice in when it was not fashionable to be so.
And also because of the horrors of the First World War, you know, it'd only been 24 years since the end of the First World War, and every family had been touched by that atrocity, really, and so we all, you know, were desperately trying to protect our children by not having them sent off to another war. So it wasn't, you know, so in a way there is a little bit of, well, Hitler's over there, and you know, we're here, and we have this channel around us, and we're going to be fine because we're, you know, Britain is a nice moderate country, and so Churchill was the guy who stood up and said, we need to resist this.
A question down here in the front.
Luke. Hi, my name is Luke Shania from the Kiev Post, yes, from Ukraine. And being a Canadian, having moved to Ukraine about 20 years ago, Churchill is extremely revered and incredibly respected figure in the country, especially from the Yalta Conference when him, Roosevelt, and Stalin, how they did that. But my question is, what are people going to discover? Basically, he's been so analyzed in so many books, so many movies, biographies, and all that. What are new fans and Churchill buffs? What's a new thing that they're going to discover in this version of your adaptation of this? And that could be to any one of you. I mean, it's a loaded question, but
I think they discovered. I think they're going to discover that he used humor as a defense mechanism, and that, as Gary was saying, people think of him as being this kind of gruff character, but actually he was incredibly funny, and that there was a kind of a sparkle constantly behind his eyes, and that got him through stuff, you know, and the importance of humor, and I think that might surprise people when they come and see the movie. What's your favorite gag of his, Gary? Yeah. Yeah, of Winston's generally.
Would you please stop interrupting me?
Yes, there's probably also the aspect, apart from the humour, which, because he's often portrayed as a sort of caricature, I've always felt, and not enough justice has been done to his sense of humour, which he believed was an essential element of seriousness, that you couldn't actually claim to be a very serious person unless you understood comedy and humour. And he really used humour as an agent for change, as if a difficult message, if coated in honey, would be swallowed. So he saw humor and language as an incredible agent, and he was primarily a writer. He was first a journalist. At the end of his life, he had written more than Shakespeare and Dickens combined. So he believed in the very core of his very poetic soul that words could be enlisted to change the world. And that was certainly my entry point into him. The other thing is that modern scholarship is sort of revealing a more three-dimensional Churchill than we've seen before, and I hope this film does something to contribute to that, because he's always been presented someone who brooked no doubt, who was always popular. A man who knew his own mind and never wavered. And when I dived into the research, and it's all available online, these are the minutes of the War Cabinet meetings conducted in these very, very trying months. It reveals a very different Churchill than we've been led to believe. He is a man who changed his position on subjects, on critical subjects, such as doing a peace deal with Hitler, by the day and sometimes by the hour. And it really begged the question as what drove him to shift his position in this wavering period. And it is my conclusion, and I think the conclusion of us all, that this period of wavering, rather than be a negative, is actually an incredibly positive aspect of leadership. In fact, a prerequisite for great leadership is to be able to consider opposite points of view, to take a period of where you get out of your own dogmatic position, take the opposite point of view, sit with it, live with it for a beat or two, synthesize those different opinions, sometimes polar opposite opinions, and then come up with your decision. And that seemed to be the journey that Winston made in making himself the great leader he became. And it's the sort of thesis of the film, which I think is news.
We have another question way at the back.
Balak from Hey You Guys. Questions to Joe. Obviously, there's no doubt that Gary can play Winston Churchill as an actor, but was there ever any concerns about transforming the look of him with all the prosthetics? And also, Gary, when you went to the loo for the first time, what was it like seeing yourself in the mirror?
Gary knew of a prosthetics guy called Kazuhiro who lived in a warehouse. Is he actually agoraphobic? He might be. He never seems to leave. And he lives in a warehouse in downtown Los Angeles and makes these incredible sculptures. And so we went and saw the master, Kazuhiro, and very quickly it became apparent that that Kazuhiro was going to be able to transform Gary as was required. There was a lot of, I mean, you know, Gary prepared for the role for many, many months, and so there was a lot of trial and error with Kazu, and the most important thing was to make sure that we didn't, you know, end up with something that looked very much like Winston, but was impossible to act through. So it was finding the right balance between Gary and Winston, really. But somehow there are certain actors who are like magicians, you know, they're shapeshifters, and somehow by sheer triumph of the imagination, they are able to transform themselves and make you believe that they are that character. And that's an incredibly powerful imagination. It's slightly weird, and a form of kind of a dark art, possibly. But they're able to do it. They're able to make you see things that aren't really there. And Gary is one such wizard.
And Gary, what was it like seeing yourself in the mirror for the first time?
Well, I had to see my, for me to be able to do it, I had to, you know, we're not, as Joe said, you can't completely lose the actor. We had to find, we went too far, and then we came back, you know, with some of the pieces we eliminated, you know, so it was a sort of, it was just a working together and seeing how it was, how doable it was. But I needed to at least see, for me, Winston looking back at me, and I think we achieved a balance between him and Gary. But Kazu is quite, talking of magicians, he's quite talented, and we lured him back from retirement because he was in the movie business and now is a fine arts, you know, artist. So we got him. We managed to get him out of retirement just to specifically do this. Yeah.
Kristin, on the other hand, who, you know, when I first sent the script to Kristin, she said no, she didn't want to do that. And I said, okay, can I come and see you in Paris and just have a cup of tea with you? What? No vaping. No vaping, no. Tea with Kristin. You have to judge the actor.
Choose your weapon.
Yeah, and so I went over to Paris to meet her, And I explained to Kristin what an important and wonderful role this was, and how she should really play the role, and it was going to be amazing and fabulous, and she was going to be extraordinary, and I was going to really, give her a lot of attention, which is often what an actor requires. And then there was a moment where she looked kind of dreamily off and said, Clemmy had very good ankles. And I knew that's I had her. Do you know what I mean? I had her then. And I knew if she's starting to obsess about the ankles, I had her. And funnily enough, the ankles were a recurring theme throughout the process of the movie. Gary was all about the prosthetics. Kristin was all about the ankles.
Yeah, that's the sort of actress I am.
The voice.
Mine was all about the shirts. All about the shirts. All about the shirts. All about the suit. That's what mine was.
We've got time for one more question.
No, I wish.
I thought it was all about the voice with you.
Huh?
I thought it was all about the voice with you.
Yeah, it is a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, one more question down here.
Price from iHeartRadio. My question is for Kristin and Gary. What did you discover about the relationship between Winston and Clementine that you did not know before?
Well, it was very fiery. They did not. They weren't always particularly sweet to each other. They were quite tough to each other, but at the same time, there was this incredible tenderness and support. And they had these lovely names for each other. She referred to him as Pig, and he was other way around. No,
Yeah.
yes,
I'm Pig.
You're
Cat.
Pig. I'm Cat.
Yeah.
And they were just really sort of sweet and supportive to each other. And then suddenly, she'd fly off the handle and have these big, fiery arguments about practical things, about life, about the household. She was very much running the house and keeping everything in the way that she felt it ought to be kept, and horrified by the amount of money that he was spending. So they had a very kind of domestic setup, which you kind of can't imagine with Winston Churchill having to worry about bills and things like that. But actually, that was very much part of their life.
Yeah, very much. With the, just the amount of champagne, cigars. You look at these bills that would, he said, I don't want to mangle the quote, but something like, I could easily get used to the best. And I guess he had lived a certain way and was going to continue. But they used to draw little pictures when they would. He would write. They would write to each other
Every day, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Even if they were staying in the same house, they'd send each other messages.
and then he would draw the little, the pig, and she would draw the cat, and it's very, very touching. I mean, they were together for so many years.
But they married quite late, didn't they? I mean, she was practically an old maid. She was on the verge of being on the
standards,
shelf.
yeah.
She was 28, I think, wasn't
Yeah.
she? Is that right? And they'd met before and then met again, and it was then the second meeting, the second dinner party that really did it.
And they had a child that died.
Yeah.
So they had,
Marjorie.
So they lived. They'd gone
Went through an awful lot together.
the hill, yeah. But I think that comes through. I think, yeah, how touching their relationship was.
You just get the sense that I think that what's great about Joe's film is that you really get the sense of a family. That this is a sort of unit. It's the domestic unit, the couple. That is all part and parcel of who Winston Churchill was and how much he needed all of that. And it was his sort of source of inspiration in some ways. I mean, she would listen to his speeches quite regularly and talk to him about what was going on in the world and give her opinions and support him and say, I really do think you should do this and you should do that. And I'm not sure how much notice he took of it, but she was allowed to have her points of view.
Yeah, I think that's in my research. She was paramount in the early years of their marriage, when he was away in the war at the front. She was his confidant. She was connected in society and like almost like a spy. She would kind of let him know
what was being said at various dinner parties.
And yeah, more than you could just get from, reading a newspaper. Yeah.
All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Darkest Hour, as I said, is a TIFF Gala presentation. It will have its red carpet premiere tonight at Roy Thompson Hall. Additional public screenings will take place Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday at various theaters at TIFF. And the film will also hit theaters across Canada and the United States on November 22nd, and in the UK on December 29th.
So book early to avoid
Book early, that's right. Thanks for being here. Thank you all for coming.